Okay, so let me, at first instance, sort of tell you a little bit about how what I'm going to be talking about relates to our sort of overarching topic, and that is that I'm going to be looking at reductionist theories of the Jeff McMahon type, and I'm going to be attempting to argue that the changing character of war with respect to what counts as victory, what counts as the beginning, what counts as, agents in war, etc. Those are good reasons to actually accept reductionist accounts of war. So in many ways, I'm actually looking at the implications of what I take to be problematic about what counts as a victory in war. As we all know, and mind you, whenever I say war, I'm going to try to say armed conflict every time. If I say war, just pretend that I said armed conflict. War has changed in many ways. It has changed spatially, it has changed temporally, agents of war have changed, technology has changed, and parallel to has changed, there has been a change in the theories that theorize about war. Now, I'm not arguing that these revisionist theories are direct results of the changing character of war. It's just been a parallel both in law and philosophy. One of these theories is the reductionist theory, or one of set of these theories are reductionist theories, and those are theories that attempt to answer questions both jus ad bellum, about what's the justification of war, as well as jus in bello, right? What counts as being a legitimate target, who can I justifiably kill, by looking at self and other defense, for example. So they will ask, what sorts of calculations, what sorts of conditions come into play when I'm trying to ask the question of, may I engage in justified self-defense, and then try to extrapolate from that some information both about justice of war and justice in war. And what I'm going to be doing is attempting to protect those theories from certain criticisms that are coming from the school sympathetic, at least, to the liability approach. So the way I'm going to sort of go about presenting this is I'm just quickly going to tell you, I'm sure you all know, but I'm quickly going to tell you a little bit about reductionist theories as I take them to be. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the criticisms. In particular, I'm going to look at Seth Lazar's criticism and David Rodin's criticism of the jus ad bellum consequences of reductionist theories. Then I'm going to look at some of the criticisms of jus in bello aspects of reductionist theories that Larry May and Andrew Fiala, for example, have put forth. And then I'm going to look at Gabby Bloom's, all those people would have been a great audience. I'm going to look at Gabby Bloom's consequences for international law of individualized approaches, as she calls them. So then I'm going to turn to what I take to be the changing character of war. And finally, I'm going to use what I said about the changing character of war to make sense of reductionist theories, or to respond to the criticisms of reductionist theories. So reductionist theories, simply, as I said, argue that there is no two different sets of morality. One set of morality applies in war, and one set of morality applies in ordinary circumstances. And what they try to do is answer questions about whether right to national self-defense can be explained by appealing to self-defense, whether humanitarian military intervention can be made sense of by appealing to ordinary other people defense. They also, and most of the reductionist theory has not been actually about jus ad bellum, it's been about jus in bello. So they also try to answer, as I'm sure you've all seen in McMahon's work, they've attempted to answer questions like, who's a legitimate target, who may I kill, why may I kill them, by looking at how facts about the aggressor and the defender work in cases of self and other defense. So I think there's at least two benefits, sort of right off the bat, prima facie benefits of a reductionist account. One of them, I think, is the analytic value. I think it is the fact that taking these complex questions like, when is war justified, or who may I kill, and starting from things that at least to some extent seem familiar, or at least more chewable, like what sorts of self-defense may I engage in, who may I kill, who may I pinch, and to what extent in engaging in self-defense, are good stepping stones to the more difficult questions in war. And another sort of related benefit of this approach is the fact that I think trying to answer these questions is really difficult because they're complex questions. So attempting to appeal to intuitions that are familiar to us, I think, is a prima facie good thing. Nonetheless, these theories have come across a lot of criticisms. Some of the criticisms, which I'm actually not going to address, are criticisms about the liability approaches altogether. As we over lunch had a lovely discussion, I think that liability approaches are intuitively right when it comes to ordinary cases of self-defense. And I also think they also tell us, I don't think they're combative with lesser evil approaches to questions about self-defense. In fact, I think liability approaches tell us where lesser evil approaches take off. So when to start engaging in lesser evil calculations. But the number one reason I'm not going to engage in this is not because everybody agrees, because not everybody agrees, right? The number one reason I'm going to be engaging in this is because people who I am going to be responding to, like Rodin, like Lazar, like May, and to some extent Andrew Fiala, probably not. I think on the ordinary cases, individual cases, accept this and start from this. So at least their criticisms of reductionist approaches do not criticize them on the level of liability. So let me first look at some of these criticisms of reductionist analysis with respect to jus ad bellum. David Rodin has, for example, argued that reductionist accounts of war cannot really make sense of, for example, the right to national self-defense. In other words, you can't look at ordinary self-defense and try to answer questions about how come we have a right to national self-defense? What is a right to national self-defense? He thinks there are three possible strategies one can go about doing this. One is the classical analogy strategy, almost like a Waltzerian approach. And then there's a strict and broad reductionist approach. All three on his account fail. So the analogous strategy is a strategy where you say something like, well, I have a right to life. That's what grounds my right to self-defense. So maybe we can find something analogous in cases of national self-defense. For example, right to common life. The problem Rodin finds with this is that either that right to common life is independent of its aims, in which case anything goes, right? Pretty much anybody and any grouping might have a right to national self-defense, and that doesn't seem to get it right. Or the right to national self-defense is tied to a particular aim, right? But then we don't walk away with a right to national self-defense that is as sweeping as we commonly, at least in law, think, right? We say that countries that are democratic and countries that are not democratic have a right to national self-defense. At least that's what we say in law. The strict reductionist account it basically says, look, a soldier has a right of self-defense. The problem with that account, Rodin thinks, is that that's simply not what we say goes in war. Soldiers very often, at least we think, are entitled to more than just the defense of themselves. They're allowed to do much more than they would be justified in doing in defending their own lives. Finally, we get to the broad reductionist strategy, which Rodin once again also thinks it fails. And it is an attempt to justify some value of sufficient worth that could ground the right to self-defense, right? Something analogous to right to life in ordinary circumstances. The problem that we come across in that case is the problem of bloodless invasion, which has been recently at least discussed quite a bit in literature, and this is where Lazar takes up the criticism of reductionism. So what is the problem of bloodless invasion? Imagine that we are being attacked, that your country is being attacked by a military group that is not going to kill anybody, right? They're just, the only thing, the only interests they're going to violate are your political interests and nothing else. That's at least what Lazar assumes. Now, he thinks that both in common sense morality and in international law, we seem to think that nonetheless you have a right to national self-defense, even to protect purely political interests. So the way his argument goes is by presenting a disjunction, right? Either you accept the common sense morality view of right to national self-defense, or you accept reductionism. You can't have it both ways, he says. And the argument proceeds through this bloodless invasion example. He thinks if the invasion is simply institutional and only violates your political interests, then in fact reductionist theories have no way of explaining how come we have a right to national self-defense. And I'm going to say much more later in response to Lazar. In part, I think that this notion of purely political interests is ambiguous, but I'm going to say a little bit more about that later when I talk about the responses to these criticisms. Okay, let me now move to the jus in bello criticisms of reductionist theories. So the jus in bello criticisms of reductionist theories come from people like Larry May and Andrew Fiala, and they're not even necessarily criticisms as much as they think that if you genuinely are going to be a reductionist, you're going to end up, if you're being serious about being a reductionist, you're going to end up as a contingent pacifist, right? Because, I mean, think about what sort of calculations you need to do if you're engaging in a McMahonian type of reduction, right? So you need to know the moral responsibility of the enemy combatant. You need to know whether or not they're posing an objectively justified or an unjustified threat. So between having to know the level of moral responsibility of each combatant and having to know the objective justification for the strategy or the tactic that they're using at the time, or the overarching aim of the war, most of the time you're not going to have sufficient legitimate targets to actually ever have justified interactions. And so you end up with this position, they think, of contingent pacifism. So what I want to then do next is quickly say a little bit about the changing character of war, and then argue that these sets of criticisms with respect to jus ad bellum and jus in bello can actually be responded to if we take the changing character of war seriously and if we think that it's a persistent change. Now, the changing character of war, I think, is mostly driven by the changes in technology. That being said, just for purposes of sort of ease, I'm going to talk about the spatial and temporal changes in character of war, the agental changes in character of war, and then the technological changes in war. So clearly, the spatial changes in war, we all know what I mean by that, right? You might have a drone operator in Pakistan, in New Mexico, sending a drone to Pakistan to take out a terrorist or a combatant or somebody like that.
Or wedding ceremony.
Or a wedding ceremony, right? You might define, and this is actually relevant because the spatial problem extends far beyond this example I gave, right? So you might think of the...
Can I ask here for a second? General McChrystal gave a very interesting apology to Karzai, president of Afghanistan, saying that one of those wedding ceremony bombings were the result of inexperience of young analysts sitting somewhere in New Mexico or Missouri. And there is a question how experienced they could become without doing some before.
One of the ways that the government has actually attempted to deal with this is at times there were attempts to say everybody who's within a certain distance of a terrorist is a presumed insurgent or a presumed terrorist as well, which, of course, I mean, we don't even need to get into the cuteness of that attempt to deal with that. But we also have the temporal changes of war, right? I mean, it clearly, President Bush standing on a boat with mission accomplished behind him doesn't announce the end of war, right? So simple announcement and simple proclamations at the end of war clearly don't seem to be, appropriately speaking, beginnings and ends of armed conflicts or wars. So similarly, you can imagine, look at Iraq right now, right? Is what's happening in Iraq right now in some sense the same war because it's in part resultant from our second engagement there? Is the second engagement a part of the first engagement? So there are all sorts of really difficult problems when we try to differentiate individual instances of war and then try to theorize about them that way. Now, similar problems arise with agents, right? And a big part of the reason why the agents in war are changing is the technological changes. And the fact, the persistence, the technology is not going to go away. So that is exactly why I think that these agental changes are also not going to change, nor temporal change is going to change, right? So now we have private militaries, we have contractors, we have terrorists, and a big part of the reason why we have these non-state actors engaging more and more in military warfare is exactly because the access to the portability, the price, and the destructive force of technology available now is just greater than it was, let's say, 50 years ago. So now an individual or a small group can engage in armed conflict. So we have these agental changes, we have temporal changes, we have spatial changes, and we have these technological changes. And all of these are here to stay. Parallel to that, we have changes in international law. And Gabby Bloom's paper that deals with the analysis between transnational policing and armed conflict law is really helpful here. Now, her argument is partly based on the claim that technology is driving this, but it's even more based on the fact that she thinks that international law has responded more and more to the focus on the individual, so that now it's no longer, the aims are no longer national security, but human security. And so with all of these changes in the character of war that I think are here to stay, I think we have much better reasons to accept reductionist theories of war. Now, before I get into my responses to the particular criticisms that I addressed earlier, let me just sort of say a little bit about what I mean by this persistent change in character of war. I think the examples I just gave give us strong reasons to think that the idea that we have war here and policing here is not helpful for picking which theories are best going to describe armed conflict, how to deal with armed conflict, how to respond to insurgents, and other instances of what I would, and I think most of us would agree, are armed conflict, right? So it's sort of like that Supreme Court judge when deciding the case on porn, he said something like, I'll know it when I see it, right? There are many instances of armed conflict where we can say we know it when we see it, right? But they don't resemble the Second World War, right? And so what I'm trying to suggest is that the change in character of war, which is here to stay, is giving us extra reasons to think that we have this continuum, a clear continuum that goes from, Second World War type of, state, or that, even other instances where we had a state and a state, to the other end of the spectrum, maybe a terrorist or something like that. Okay, so why do I think that this change in character of war and persistence of the change in character of war are giving us more reason to accept reductionist accounts of war? And I'm hoping this is probably already obvious, but let me first say something about the jus ad bellum. If you remember, the criticism of reductionist accounts with respect to their ability to answer jus ad bellum questions was the bloodless invasion example. The problem was reductionist accounts cannot account for the right to national self-defense in cases of bloodless invasion. I think that particular criticism, first of all, depends on an equivocation or ambiguity that's being exploited between several notions of what it means to be a political interest. So on one sense, there can be a political interest that is an interest that allows us to engage in self-determination and engage in protecting our basic liberties. So if you allow me to translate vital interests from, let's say, Lazar's paper to Rawlsian's language of basic liberties, it is pretty clear that we need institutions as well as some level of self-determination to get to the fair value of basic liberties, right? None of us are after pieces of paper that say, here's your right to life, here's your right to life. We're all after the fair value of such rights. And for the fair value of such rights, we need political institutions that ideally we decided to arrange ourselves around or with. Now, I take it that at times Lazar's argument depends on saying something much weaker about this purely political interest, where the purely political interest is something like a country comes in, takes over your institutions, they're not funneling money to their country, they're not killing you, they're not taking your resources, right? But that seems to me not to be a right to a right of a kind that could ground right to national self-defense. That seems to me like something like a right against immigration, which is not as commonsensical nor is it as sweeping as I think rights to national self-defense is in law. Now then you might ask yourself, okay, so what I am saying is the reductionist theories actually don't think that we have a right to national self-defense in the case of bloodless invasion, when such bloodless invasion is actually only intending to come over, take the institutions, run them the way we originally intended, without funneling any funds outside. But I think that's a plus. I think that the fact that reductionist theories propose that is actually matching the changes in international law that are carving out more and more space from this absolute right to national self-defense. So I'm not persuaded that this is necessarily a problem. In fact, it is anticipatory of the changing character of war and the changing international law with respect to war. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention was the response to jus in bello from the changing character of war. So I was very sympathetic to the distinction, or what I took to be the distinction, between the classical distinction that many of the military forces in the United States have as well, between the strategic, the operational, and the tactical levels of analysis. Ziv Bohrer and Mark Ossiel have recently come out with a paper that proposes that different accounts of proportionality work better on the strategic, operational, and tactical level. So where the strategic level is the overarching, what is our aim as a country, let's say. Operational level is the level where we connect strategy to tactics, and then tactical level is we go in with a group of soldiers and attempt to secure a building in a city. Now I think that separation of proportionality or analysis of conditions of what justifies engaging in war, together with the changing character of war, actually allows us to say that there's going to be more and more cases where an individual combatant will in fact be able to engage in the sort of a calculation that the reductionist would expect of them. The reason I think that is the case is because, once again, first of all, an individual soldier need not look to the overarching strategy. That's number one. All they need to look at is the individual tactic. But more importantly, with respect to the changing character of war, I take it that it's going to be much easier to see what the objective justification for a particular activity will be. So let me give you an example. An account like this would have the tools to differentiate between, let's say, a private military engaging in protection of an oil well in Iraq and a Navy SEAL team engaging in extracting civilians from a area of a city. It would be able to do that because the sorts of calculations that need to go into whether or not this action is justified with respect to jus in bello, proportionality, necessity, would be done on a much closer level to the person that needs to engage in them. So ultimately, and this is where I'm just going to stop, ultimately what I'm hoping that we take away from that is that, in fact, war is so much shifted closer to the ordinary cases of self-defense that we should accept, or at least look to, analysis of self-defense and other defense in individual circumstances to identify answers to difficult questions about jus in bello and jus ad bellum. Thank you.